Thank you for again joining me for the Daily Bread Bible Study here for day 209. This is Monday, July 27th, 2020, focusing on Isaiah chapters 47 through 49. So Isaiah starts out with some harsh words, even words that I kind of disagree with in spirit, but then ends on a positive note, a reassuring and reaffirming note that God will redeem us. So in Isaiah 47, Isaiah, the prophet, has harsh words for Babylon, the enemies of the people of Judah, and the kingdom which has harshly oppressed the people of God. Now, there's no love lost for this brutal kingdom in the Bible. We have Psalms like 137, which illustrate the points in verse 8 of Psalm 137. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. From a biblical perspective, what Babylon did was tyrannical, right? They harshly oppressed the people of Judah, exiled them out of their homeland, and the siege of Jerusalem lasted a long time. It was very heartbreaking for the people in Jerusalem, I imagine. Yet, I still can't condone the actions that are, called to take against infants. I understand that the people of Judah are angry against the Babylonians and really want to reciprocate what had been done to them, which was that their little ones had been killed off. And gosh, it's war is hell, is what is said, and this idea is there's hatred is just brewing. There's a lot of life circumstances that reinforce this hatred, and just direct encounters of very terrible things. So this is just a terrible image, both on the hands that this would happen to the children of Judah and the children of Babylon. And even if the Babylonians killed Judean infants in this horrible manner, retributive actions are just impermissible. It just doesn't make the world a better place. It just tears down and kills and destroys, and the whole world suffers. Hate just blinds us from recognizing the humanity of others and enables us to justify our own inhumane actions. It's a very slippery slope. I find hatred in the imagery of uncovering the nakedness of Babylon, another image that we have from here in Isaiah. Now, the problem with this image is its disregard for the sanctity of a woman's body. Proper respect for others' bodies is a common theme, especially in Leviticus chapter 18, where in 13 different verses it states that the boundary around someone's nakedness should not be crossed. It is inhumane and ungodly to violate someone else's boundaries without their consent. And even in Leviticus 18, even though it's an older time period, they still have a sense that that is the right thing to do. Now, Babylon was oppressive. There is no doubt about that. But the main point of shame on Babylon could be made without using this image of defilement and humiliation. In verse 10, it kind of captures the sentiments well. In Isaiah 47:10, you felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray, and you said in your heart, I am, but there is no one else. But evil shall come upon you, which you cannot charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, which you will not be able to ward off, and ruin shall come on you suddenly, of which you know nothing. All of these words directed towards Babylon, who the people of Judah think are too proud and have a little bit of hatred towards. In Isaiah 48, moving on to address Judah/Israel, God explains why everything has happened. First, Judah was stubborn. They wanted to follow their own ways and create their own idols. Then God allowed Babylon to take Judah captive. Yet even in the suffering of the captivity, God was refining the people to turn from profaning God's name to revering God's name. In Isaiah 48, verse 8, "You have never heard, you have never known. From of old your ear has not been opened. For I knew that you would deal very treacherously, and that from your birth you were called a rebel. For my name's sake I will defer my anger. For the sake of my praise I restrain it for you, so that I may not cut you off." So even in God's frustration with God's people, God still has a sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's humane and what's inhumane. God will not utterly destroy God's people. Now in Isaiah 49, we get to a more positive note. Isaiah speaks of a, quote, servant, which I take namely to be Israel. There is an extent to which this imagery applies to the prophet Isaiah himself, and for Christians, Jesus can be seen here, and also really anybody who follows in God's ways. God has these words for his servant, starting in Isaiah 49, verse 6. "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So this idea of reverence of God, even at the hands of King Cyrus of Persia, the one who allowed for the temple to be rebuilt and invited anybody to go to Jerusalem to rebuild it. This salvation will be brought on by God for God's chosen. And with God's blessing, God will draw his people to himself, even across usually intimidating deserts. Isaiah 49, verse 9 says, "Come out to those who are in the darkness, show yourselves. They shall feed along the ways. On all the bare heights shall be their pasture. They shall not hunger or thirst. Neither scorching wind nor sun shall strike them down. For he who has pity on them will lead them, and by springs of water he will guide them. And I will turn all my mountains into roads, and my highways shall be raised up." We close this section with imagery of tender connection of God and God's people, having a positive image of mothers used as that vision. In Isaiah 49:15 it says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child, or show compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you, says God." In Isaiah 49:25, God ends with the idea that I will contend with those who contend with you and save your children. So even in the midst of the beginning, talking about Babylonians dashing the children's heads on stones and the Judeans wanting to reciprocate that, we have a promise that God will in fact keep that from happening again, that God will save God's people, God will be gracious to the children, and that community will prosper and flourish. And so we give thanks for that happening. We give thanks for the community of faithful Judeans, now that we call the Jews. We give thanks that our Christian heritage has come from that, and that God has continued to preserve life and provide blessings for those who revere him. So may we follow in God's ways and not profane God's name or profane the justice that God calls us to. May we act in ways that are gracious and loving in all facets of our life. So thank you for joining me. I wish you blessings. Have a wonderful day.